toward the end of September, I got a call one morning from the State Department asking me if I would like a speaker on the Middle East. And I said, well, nothing's really happening, but I guess I'll take one. A day later, the war broke out, which, made us really write in, because we were scheduled to have a State Department speaker on the Middle East, and here they were in the middle of a war. Great. About a week before our speaker was supposed to come, his entire visit was canceled, which meant I had to cancel 2 convocations, incredible number of meetings, lunch, etc. So we sort of unarranged everything and went through that process. As the war tapered down on the off and on process, his visit was rescheduled, and I said, well, nothing can go wrong this time. So I was informed that he would arrive in the Twin Cities sometime over the weekend and that I should contact him Monday night. Duly last night about 6:30, I picked up my phone and nothing happened. And I picked it up again and nothing happened, and I jiggled it a few more times and still nothing happened. And it finally dawned on us that our phone was totally dead. And I somehow began to think this fit in with the whole series on the visit. We went out and placed a phone call to the phone company, who said they might be able to fix it, and then again they might not. We waited an hour and a half, and we assumed that meant they might not. So I went out and placed a series of phone calls, one to his hotel, one to Karen Hayes to call him, and one to Miles Stenchel to call him. With the true efficiency of the hotel, he got none of those messages. He woke up this morning wondering what in the world had happened to me, and he called Augsburg to find out, only to discover that, we had been leaving messages all over the place for him. But in any case, he is here, and we're thoroughly delighted. Our guest this morning is the Deputy Public Affairs Advisor to the Near East and South Asian Bureau in the Department of State. He has been in the Foreign Service since 1964. And he has served assignments in Cairo and in Rome. He is a native of Detroit and has a BA from the University of Michigan and an MA from Johns Hopkins University in the Near Eastern Studies. He has also worked for HEW and for the international section of the Department of Labor. It gives me really very great pleasure to introduce to you Wilbur Wright, who will talk to you on the Arab-Israeli War. Wilbur?
Thank you very much, Dr. Noonan. If one looks at that situation too carefully, one might conclude there is a plot afoot. But I trust that the tentacles of the intelligence services haven't penetrated to Augsburg College. The cancellation back in October really, believe it or not, was due to overfilled schedule. I was fortunate enough to work on the task force that was formed in the Department of State to keep abreast of what was going on and see that all messages got out to the proper people in the government. And I was assigned to that task force, and because I was on the task force and also working full-time in my own office with press relations and so forth, they thought it better to just cancel rather than try to reschedule or do part of it. I'm going to make just a few remarks about the Middle East war and then throw it open to questions. There are just a few things about the war that strike me as a little unusual and unique, and I think are worthy of special attention because they will have an impact on the nature of the negotiations and the nature of the peace if one is attained, and the structure of relations that will emerge from the war in the Middle East, as well as a number of relations between countries outside the Middle East. The first and most striking thing to me is that the Arabs have attained some kind of unity. They have been able to maintain that unity now for nearly 2 months. It's about the first time. At this point, there are really only 2 dissenting countries from the main thrust of the chiefs of state, and they are Libya and Iraq. But Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, these alone are quite remarkable. Egypt typically, in the view I think of most observers, has played kind of a centrist role. Syria, typically to Western eyes, has been considered in a somewhat more radical leftist role, with Saudi Arabia in a much more conservative position. and rarely has it been possible to get more than one or two of these countries together to agree on a policy line. But for the first time, we have these three, and in addition, all of the North African states, except, of course, for Libya, and the Persian Gulf states, and those south on the southern end of the peninsula, Yemen. There is a new country there, of course, that has not been an actor in this whole process in any meaningful way as far as we can discern. That's the Popular Democratic Republic of Yemen. But the main Arab states appear to be quite solid in their unity. The communique issued by the Arab chiefs of state last week is something I think quite worth reading for those who are especially interested in Middle Eastern policy. So the first thing I think is unique about this conflict is the Arab unity. Secondly, what has been interpreted in the United States as an anti-United States bias that has been asserted in an effective way by the complete cutoff of Arab oil shipments to the United States. Now in '67 we saw a certain anti-American policy emerge in the severance of diplomatic relations by nearly every Arab state in the region. But not every Arab state broke diplomatic relations, and secondly, I think most scholars interpret those breaks in relations as having a meaning not in terms of relations with the United States, but having a significance in internal politics. Which is to say, the interpretation in the West of those breaks was that the Arabs had to explain somehow their defeat. They had to blame someone. They had to explain why it was, after many years of preparation, they lost the war against such a small country, Israel. And so they introduced the United States into the equation and blamed the defeat on the United States. So this is an internal domestic political problem that was being answered by anti-Americanism, at least in the minds of Western interpreters. But the action this time is something that's self-generated. That is, the Arab chiefs of state themselves decided on a policy to bring pressure on the United States by cutting off oil. So the United States became, in effect, without its intending to, an effective and important actor in the whole process in a new and different kind of way. A perhaps minor matter, but I think worthy of interest, is the role of a location in the area called Sharm el-Sheikh. And what makes it significant is that in 1956, the Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula was made contingent upon the Egyptian agreement not to put military forces into Sharm el-Sheikh. And for those of you who can remember back to 1967, the immediate cause for the outbreak of war was that the Egyptians had put military forces at Sharm el-Sheikh. So it had played a significant role in two of the previous conflicts. And it seems to me in this situation, for the first time, Sharm el-Sheikh has become in effect irrelevant. The blockade, pardon me, I withdraw that word because a blockade was never declared, but the obstructions or the difficulties that were made, that were applied to the Straits of the Bab el-Mandeb at the southern end of the Red Sea, make it possible, it would appear, for the Arabs to interdict Israeli shipping into the Red Sea at that point. And if that can be done, there really is no point in arguing about militarization at Sharm el-Sheikh, because if you can't get through the Bab el-Mandeb, you can't even get to Sharm el-Sheikh. So that, I think, involves or suggests an important change in the whole strategy of talks and in the strategy of relations that will have to emerge from these talks. The rather clear and strong involvement of the Third World, I think, is another new element. In previous conflicts and over the 25 years, the Arabs have been slowly gearing up their propaganda effort, their diplomatic machinery, to try and persuade others to support them in this conflict. And it appears, to me at least, that for the first time it has borne some real, meaningful, and tangible fruit. Perhaps you've noted in the press, because it's gotten a good deal of attention in the United States, that 25 African states broke diplomatic relations with Israel during the war. For those of you who are African studies, students of African studies, or of the Middle East, examination of each of those relationships particularly the larger countries, is significant because some of those relationships are very strong and offered considerable benefit to the African state involved. I think particularly of Nigeria, Congo, Ethiopia, Kenya. These are countries that drew great benefits from the Israeli relationship, and in spite of that, they broke relations with the Israelis. This is the first time in this conflict between the Arabs and the Israelis that the oil has been used as a weapon. It's been talked about for years. The more radical Arab states, most notably the states that didn't have any oil, consistently called upon those that did have the oil to use it in the conflict. And this is the first time they've been able to actually bring the oil into the conflict and use it as a device to help their cause. Something that's gone almost entirely unnoticed is the Arab agreement to sit down at an authoritative level face to face with the Israelis. This has been a major stumbling block in trying to get negotiations started. But it would appear, on the basis of what the newspapers tell us and those messages that I've seen in the Department of State, that the Arabs have, by indirection, agreed to meet on a responsible level, face to face, in a closed forum with the Israelis to discuss working out an understanding between the two. Connected with that, and equally important, I think, is what appears to be I'll change that because President Sadat said it directly and clearly, that the Arab states are willing to recognize Israel and to agree that it has a right to exist. Now, there have been contradictory interpretations of Arab conduct and statements on this before, but we have now from a responsible Arab chief of state a clear recognition and acceptance of the continued existence of Israel. I think this launches us into a new kind of relationship and a new kind of situation. For the first time, the Arabs have had a clear and public success in military conflict. Heretofore, the Arab military achievements in these conflicts has been relatively obscure and in terms of total impact on the overall conflict, nominal. But the Egyptian crossing of the Suez Canal and establishment of a military position over there and ability to maintain it is a new and first thing of which the Arabs are quite proud. And from what I've seen of Western military commentators, they're justly proud. It's a rather important and significant military achievement. The Syrian experience, of course, was somewhat different, but that the Syrians managed to seriously threaten the Israeli position on the northern front is taken as significant and suggesting a certain measure of success. Now, behind that, I think the most significant aspect of that is the effect it's had on Arab pride, their own sense of confidence, their sense of well-being, which I think is the basis for their feeling that they can go to the conference table and sit down and talk to the Israelis. But behind that also is a recognition, certainly on the Arab side and possibly on the Israeli side as well, that the cost of war is much greater now than it ever had been before. It'll be much more difficult for the Israelis in the future, barring some technological changes. It'll be much more difficult with given conventional warfare as it is now fought, for the Israelis to achieve the overwhelming victories that they have in the past. Thirdly, and this is I guess about eighthly, in my last point, the European involvement. By the cuts in production, 25% immediate reduction and 5% subsequent reductions, the Arabs have brought the European attention fully and forcefully to bear on the Middle East situation. The Europeans have been seen by many as trying to avoid involvement, as most people in the world, I think, trying to avoid involvement in other people's conflicts. And to a large extent, the Europeans have been successful in this. There have been a number of direct confrontations, but the Europeans as a group now have been brought to focus on the issue of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And it appears they intend to be involved and to make a contribution to this. And this, too, I think, is a new element in the Arab-Israeli conflict. With those as background, I hope some of that's provocative, stimulating. Throw it open to questions. Yes, sir.
I don't know if I've got a three-part question or maybe three questions, but one, could you just comment a little bit more about the 25 African countries that have diplomatic relations with Israel in terms of the significance of those relationships, and you alluded to that, but if you could go a little bit more into detail. And secondly, why is it so much so that America gives the amount of aid or whatnot that it does to Israel? In other words, why is America such a staunch ally of Israel, and is it in direct relationship to the fact that the Arabs seem to get a lot of aid from the Soviet Union and whatnot? So I guess just those two questions.
Okay. I think one could write a book about the African states breaking relations. There are many features. I find it rather fascinating that this has taken place. I was very interested and impressed over the years with the Israeli effort in Africa. They achieved a number of impressive successes in their technical assistance to African countries by being small and having highly skilled, disciplined technicians go out to zero in on a problem of limited magnitude, that is one man or two or three men, small team working on a particular problem. They're able to achieve some rather impressive successes, and also to avoid a lot of colossal failures that a bureaucratic machinery that larger states, by the nature of their circumstance, tend to generate, get into. They undertook small, specific projects with measured impact, and they were very successful. They also went in for military assistance of a similar type. Pick a limited group of troops or a particular group of officers or non-commissioned officers with a specific purpose. For example, airborne training was something they went in for in a number of countries. President Sese Seko Mobutu in the Congo is an Israeli-trained paratrooper, for example. They have been very active in training, I suppose, commando-type troops in some East African countries, in Kenya. They've been active with the the police forces in a number of other countries. They went in big in West Africa for development of the tourist industry, and from the reports I've seen, have been extremely successful in that, the Ivory Coast being the most notable of them. High quality, high performance tourist facilities where they hadn't existed before. Hotels with air conditioning, where the services function, where everything that's supposed to happen does happen. And the relationships between those particular countries, I think, had become notably close. The Congo, Kenya, the Ivory Coast. There are a number of other situations where they have been very effective, but those stand out in my thinking. Now, the Arabs have used a diplomatic tactic that has many facets, and it worked differently on different countries, which in itself suggests a certain kind of sophistication. To counteract this bond that whose roots, in the view of some people, was in the technical assistance, the benefits that the Arab countries derived, they offered money. But the principal forum, the principal device for persuading the African countries to take the position to support the Arabs was the African Summit Conference, the African Chiefs of State and the Organization of African Unity, which had a meeting in, I guess it was September. And at that meeting, there was a commitment made. And then again in October, the commitment that was made in September was given force and effect. And the African states, one after the other, right down the line, broke. Many of them did it very regretfully, but the immediate issue, and this I think says something about the Israeli tactics and situation really. The immediate issue that was used to explain the break, or was I guess the best term, I can't think of a better one, the immediate excuse for breaking relations was the Israeli continued occupation of Arab territory. By most standards of international conduct in this post-war period, that is post-World War II, post-1945 period, it is no longer acceptable, generally speaking, for one country to seize and hold the territory of another by military force. And this has become, as time goes by, it seems to be becoming enshrined in the thinking of nations and in international affairs generally. But the Israelis, in effect, have moved in and occupied territory, and no formula has been found to persuade them to evacuate it. So the Arabs, I think one could say, have made this a moral issue, that there's no justification for continued occupation of foreign territory by military force. I haven't done this yet, but I think it would be interesting to look at the statements of the U.S. government in 1956, when you recall the United States government intervened in the Middle East situation and demanded that the Israelis withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. Remember, the British and French dropped paratroopers along the Suez Canal, and the Israelis came in a day or two later and swept down through Sinai and occupied it and refused to withdraw until certain conditions were met. The initial position of the U.S. government was that they had to withdraw unconditionally. And in fact, it appears now that certain conditions were imposed and certain conditions were met. But this appears to have been done, if not secretly, certainly not in any public display way. So it appeared, in effect, that the Israelis made an unconditional withdrawal on moral grounds. And that was not done in '67, and it's become a rallying cause for in Africa and in some other countries. Your second question
was why does the United States just very clearly point toward alliance with Israel?
Why does the United States support Israel? I really don't think I can say much more than the Secretary of State said in response to essentially the same question in his last press conference, when he said there are strong, or was it in Peking? I think it was in the Peking press conference, I beg your pardon. I have a transcript of it here. There are strong emotional ties. He gave three reasons. Strong emotional ties with the United States to Israel. Secondly, it's a democracy, and the United States believes in supporting democracies generally. And thirdly, it is a going enterprise in the area. It's an operating state. It has elections. It's established itself. It has roots. It's self-sustaining.
Yeah, okay. I wouldn't want to get into just a discussion about those the reasons that he gave, but they all seem to me to be
ephemeral, superficial. I know that this has come up before with students. They raise that question. It's largely a materialistic world. Well, we do have close economic relations with Israel, to be sure. But I think one shouldn't make light of these reasons. I could engage in a two-sided debate, perhaps, on this. One of the things that has come up from students and some others has been that we also have close relations with some non-democratic governments, and yet we support democracy in the case of Israel. Well, I think that certainly in the American people, I think in the American Congress, and I'm persuaded in each American administration, there really is a desire and a commitment to try and support democracies where they exist. Now, obviously, there are times, and I say this off the record and for myself rather than for the State Department, there are times and circumstances when it just is not possible to interpose American force to protect a government. The most conspicuous one, of course, was 1950, the Tibet incident, when the Chinese went into Tibet. We had proclaimed our undying opposition to Chinese expansion, and yet they took this huge piece of real estate, and the United States didn't lift a finger. Well, there's no way to get to Tibet. You'd have to operate out of India or out of South Asia, and there's just no way we could get in there. And there are any number of other situations that we just didn't intervene. Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, the more advertised circumstances. But we do have a commitment to democracy, both internally and outside, that we don't always act according to those principles. I think doesn't negate the fact that we retain our commitment. This is true, I think, in individual there are dangers in making an analogy between individual conduct and conduct of nations, but I think it is valid in this case. The individual has commitments to certain principles and to certain attitudes and policies. Sometimes it breaks down.
This is just my last point. Are not some of the same countries that have broken relationships with the Israelis just and sound and stable democracies in the sense of the definition or the operating assumption that America takes in terms of looking at countries that are declared as democracies? And how do they justify, in other words, I mean, it's the whole thing about supporting democracies. The African countries that say have aligned themselves with the Arabs in terms of the conflict are, democracies as well. And, even the Arab states themselves are democracies in a sense. So, I don't really see the justification of saying democracy unless I don't understand, what democracy is all about.
Well, in 1984, they say some people are more equal than others. I think there are varying degrees of democracy. The kind of democracy that they have in Israel, I think, is an impressive one that exceeds the standards in most of the world. It's a small country, of course, which offers an advantage, but the ability of the individual citizen to participate and to make his views, if not his feelings, if not his views, felt in the government is great. He can get access to his representative in the national parliament. There are any number of organizations that are active in political affairs. They have a democracy that functions in a much more impressive way, I think, than you find in many other countries. I'm sure I think the Department of State would be reluctant to start passing out grades on how much democracy there is in a given country. As I said, that I remembered a speech that Dean Rusk made some years ago in which he talked about why we support some countries and not others, and he seemed to be making an attempt, I think a very dangerous attempt, to hand out grades. There's more democracy in this country and less in that, and this country and degrees of communism. For political scientists, I think you could make a fascinating, if it hasn't already been done, kind of tabulation of set up objective criteria as to what constitutes a democracy and what constitutes various kinds of freedom, and then make up a computer table on that. Dr. Noonan?
One thing that struck me about the current Arab-Isreali war is that more Americans are questioning our relationship to Israel than did in the preceding Arab-Israeli wars. And I wonder if you think it's either the recurrence of the war, that once more is just too much, or whether you think it's the oil factor. The shortage of oil now makes many Americans question where our loyalties lie.
I think it's in the latter category. Again, it's my personal opinion. The relationship with Israel is starting to cost us something, and the cost is becoming more apparent. In addition, I think we're concerned about what appears to be a kind of isolation that's developing. It's had a negative effect on our Western European alliance relationships. It probably has produced at least a nominal strain in our relations with a number of other third world countries. And then, of course, there's the immediate opposite and an apparent, obvious effect of the oil cutoff, which has had a powerful effect in the United States and in Western Europe. So I think it's a combination of all these things that at a time when we've had terrible inflation, costs of government continue to go up, the widely publicized figure on the cost of the arms that we supplied Israel, I think has had an effect. That issue became sensitive at that particular time because of the other issues that were already around. The juxtaposition of $2.2 billion for arms for Israel when the liberal Democrats have been fighting to try and reduce the arms budget, and we are debating about whether we're going to go for the Trident or not, I think made it additionally sensitive. And I think at such times it's not only normal and it's to be expected that people start reevaluating We've done this always in the past, but is this something we want to continue to do in the same way as we always have, just because for the reasons that we used to have? Maybe there's some new factors we ought to consider. I think the peace effort that we are now making would have been undertaken anyway. I'm certain that something comparable to what's going on now would have taken place probably in the spring of next year. In fact, it might be going on. The Israeli elections were scheduled for October originally, October 31st, if I recall correctly. And there were indications that then the Israelis would feel prepared to go to the negotiating table. But the war broke out on October 6th, and so they've had to postpone their elections. But many commentators, at least, and some authoritative people felt that after the Israeli elections, serious negotiation, a real major effort was going to be undertaken. Well, the war changed all that, the timetable and framework and so forth. But the cost of the support for Israel, I think, is and the obvious cost, we've been made aware of it, is what I think explains the tendency on the part of many Americans now to wonder about the cost of Israel, about the continued support for Israel. This has come up repeatedly. This is now my third school, and I don't think there's been one audience that hasn't raised exactly that question or challenged it. You'll be next. Let me give the young lady here.
I think one of the biggest problems in finding a final peace is the West Bank situation. And I would like to know what the U.S. stand is. You said previously the U.S. just supports peace, but would the U.S. support a free Palestinian state, or would they say that this land must go back to Jordan, the Jordanian kingdom? And my second question is the status of Jerusalem, where the Jews say, Israelis say they will not give up Jerusalem, yet the Arabs find this just as dear a city. Would you consider, or would the U.S. consider internationalizing the city, which did not work before, or back to the separation?
Okay, for those of you who can't hear the questions, there are two. The first one is about the West Bank of the Jordan River that was occupied in '67 and is now held by Israel. What is the American attitude about the status of the West Bank? And the second question is about the status of Jerusalem. What does the U.S. government support? Until this morning, I felt reasonably confident in repeating what I've been saying for some weeks now. That is, the U.S. government will not prepare a peace plan. We're not going to get in the position of trying to tell these two parties how they should work out their relations. If the relationship, I want to say it again and then tell you what causes the confusion. If the relationship is to be a stable one, people in the area must be responsible for it. Anwar Sadat has to tell the Egyptian people that this is a peace that I support and I am your representative. I've done this. If you don't like it, I'll leave. One way or the other, he has to imply that by taking a stand on this. And the same thing on the Israeli side. They make an agreement. They have to make, if it's going to stand, if he's not going to say, to avoid the situation in which Sadat or Mrs. Mayer goes back and said, well, we don't like the peace agreement, but what could we do? The Americans imposed it on us. That invites elements in the population to say, well, let's destroy the peace. Let's go back to war. Or for the chief of state himself to induce that kind of thing. I personally am persuaded that is exactly the position to take. I think it's futile and impossible and destructive for an outside force to come in and try to impose a peace in an area that's so volatile and in which arms are already so abundant. They can break the peace anytime they want to, with or without our permission on either side. There's an item in this morning's local newspaper that the secretary will have a peace plan in his pocket. He won't offer it, but the implication is that he's willing to help them break particular deadlocks, and I would hope that our effort will be confined to that. Now, on the West Bank, I don't think we really have any deep-seated feelings of our own about it, but there's certain consequences that would flow from the creation of a Palestinian state that I think in the views of many people, official and non-official, would create new problems. As a matter of fact, just yesterday, there was in the audience a Palestinian student, and we got into an exchange, and I asked him how he felt about the creation of a Palestinian state between Jordan and Israel. He said that would be very good. That would give us a base from which to operate. And I think those who are talking about various options are aware of what this could mean. No matter what the peace arrangements turn out to be, there almost certainly will be some people who will oppose them. Now, it would appear to be in the interest of everyone to diminish or limit, if possible, the ability of those dissidents to destroy the peace. But it would appear to some, and to me, that creation of a Palestinian state in the current atmosphere would really be to do exactly what this young man said, create a base of operations for forays into Israel and to create a new war-type situation. That's one interpretation. Now, maybe it could work. But the policy of the U.S. government on that, I really don't know. Jerusalem, I think, is rather hopeful. I was impressed with the item in the communique issued by the Arab chiefs of state, particularly on the background of the report that King Faisal's proposal had been rejected. King Faisal, according to the press reports, proposed that the chiefs of state call for return to Arab hands of Jerusalem. Instead, they agreed to call for the Israeli withdrawal from Jerusalem. And there's an important difference, because mere withdrawal, first of all, he doesn't define Jerusalem. So is he talking about the Arab sector of Jerusalem, all of Jerusalem, Greater Jerusalem, the holy places in Jerusalem? We don't know. This leaves a latitude for negotiation. I discovered another phrase that Dr. Charles Malik, the famous Lebanese, foreign minister at one time and participant in the drafting of the UN Charter and the Declaration of Human Rights. He was at East Lansing when I was there, and he spoke about a healthy diplomatic ambiguity. And I think that's what we have in the Arab communique as regards Jerusalem. There's room for honorable negotiation. I think the United States supports at least access to the city by people of all faiths, which means Muslims, Christians, as well as Jews. In terms of the territorial arrangement, I suspect that our position is ambiguous, except as we can determine that particular types of arrangements might be deleterious or detrimental to the peace. That's about as well as I think I can do with that. This man's been waiting for quite a while.
Yeah, I would just like to comment on the question that was raised about the reason for continuing U.S. support of Israel. You haven't mentioned it as one of the reasons, but I personally feel one of the obvious reasons is of American Jews in the United States and their role with the economic situation.
The American Jewish community unquestionably has an effect, I think, on American policy in the Middle East. Senator Fulbright, I think it was, who said that on any issue affecting the Middle East, 90 United States senators can be brought to vote favorably on the Israeli side in favor of Israel. It's difficult to say a great deal on that without appearing to be impolitic. The American Jewish community is the Zionist elements of the American Jewish community, to be more precise and accurate, have a rather considerable influence on American policy and have for many years. I don't think, however, that means that they control American policy alone and that the rest of Americans are helpless. I think there is, across the board, a deep American attachment to Israel. For primarily, I suppose, religious reasons. The Old Testament, I think, means a great deal to Americans. the mail coming into the Department of State suggests that this is true. There's been more questioning from what I've seen of the mail than ever before. But I think the commitment remains firm. This is most notable in the South, where you have the fundamentalist Protestant church. And the barriers just seem to transcend racial considerations. You find, at least from what I've seen, it would appear that Catholics from the Southwest, blacks in the South, whites, Southern Baptists, Methodists, still have this deep, profound attachment and belief that Israel has a right to exist. I've had some rather interesting experiences in that connection. One woman wanted to go get the chapter of Revelations from the Bible and to point out to me that this is foretold in the Bible, what is happening there now. And I'm glad to be a part of the fulfillment of God's prophecy on this earth now. With this kind of thinking, and I think it's much more pervasive than you might think, it has an effect on policy. Since there's no one, go ahead, again.
I mean, I go along with what you say, but don't you feel that America in general is evident of pressure that can be applied to it by the Jewish community?
America is?
Don't you feel that America is evident of the pressure that can be applied by the Jews in this country as far as boycotting is concerned?
Impotent. I'm sorry, that America, you mean that we're powerless in the face? Could you put that another way?
All right, what I'm trying to say is don't you personally feel that America is aware of the pressure that the Jews in America can put on the government and its political situation to its further role in the economic system?
Yeah, do I think the American population in general is aware of what you, I think, are insinuating is some kind of disproportionate Jewish power over the rest of American foreign policy? Is that your question? I don't know. I really be hard put to try to answer that question. It's a hard one for me really to come to grips with. I don't really know how aware or sensitive or concerned Americans are about Jewish influence or Zionist influence in our foreign policy is. We get a disproportionate amount of mail on the Middle East question, and a substantial part of it comes from organized Zionist groups in the United States. But this, I think, is not particularly surprising, in my view, certainly not sinister. They have a proprietary direct interest. If Ireland, for example, were threatened with outside war, with a foreign war, I think we'd get a tremendous amount of mail from Catholic churches, from cathedrals and dioceses and so forth around the country. Back in the 60s, I wasn't in Washington at the time, but when the Congo thing broke, there was a tremendous amount of mail into the department from black churches concerned about this problem. So when a particular segment of the American population becomes concerned about a problem in their land, their ancestral land, the mail starts to flow in. It happens that the Israeli thing has never really settled down, so that over time, particularly in this year, there's been disproportionate amount of mail from the Jewish community about the question. There, incidentally, just I think it's worth noting, because this I think is a somewhat sensitive issue, that there is a very strong, a deeply committed, I don't want to say powerful, but a very strong in feeling and fairly large in number anti-Zionist group that is active in the United States. Alfred E. Lilienthal is the leading spokesman of it, and there's some officials from Sears Roebuck too who are ardently anti-Zionist. We don't hear from them nearly as much, but they are active in the United States as well. This young man, and you, sir, please.
Well, I refer to your comment. You might like to look at a publication called The Cross and Flag. It's has a for its strong, yes, has some strong articles against Zionist movement, and they're also calling for a new prophet restore the American tradition who would be more outspoken than laws, something like that. That's something.
That's a response, a suggestion to read the cross and the flag. I don't know the book. Yes, sir.
Yes. But what I'm thinking it's a newspaper service. But what I'm trying to know is about the elections that are coming up in Israel. And from what I've heard, it's the believe that there's going to be a more militaristic government coming to the fore. I was just wondering what percent of the nations that would have with American policy.
I'm really, unfortunately, not in a position to comment on that. I've seen the last poll I saw was about nearly 2 weeks ago that the Likud party, which is tends to be right-wing and takes a hard line on negotiations and compromise with the Arabs, had 45%. If the elections were held that day, according to this poll, the Likud party returned about 45%, and the Mapai and its allies will only have 45% with an indecisive. Well, that's an incredible shift. Mrs. Meir in September was 65% ahead. That's a 20% shrinkage, and it appeared that this was going to be an onward-going thing. From what I've seen of reports about what's going on inside Israel, there's some fascinating debates going on. It's a perfect laboratory for the political scientists if you can only keep up with all the things that are going on. Tendencies, counter-tendencies, right-wing is flourishing, but the left is also, there are those who also say the cost of this war, the destruction of this war, make it more evident than ever before that we must have peace. Of course, on the other hand, there are those who say the cost of this war, the lives lost, make it more evident than ever that we must be stronger than ever to prevent it ever happening again. There are a lot of analogies between what's being said in their defense debate and what we have heard in the United States on the same subject. But in addition, you have a whole wide range of serious and important debate about what Israel is to become. What should be the status of the religion in the state? Should they continue with the strong input of religious content to civil, what other people consider civil law? What should be the future of the Arab population, of the non-Jewish population? I'll stop there. Yes, sir.
My question has to do with the Israel-Syrian war, the war up in the Golan Heights.
Yes, sir.
I don't know about the accuracy of my information, but I've heard that Syria had, in terms of equipment, a very much more equipment in terms of tanks.
Yes.
Than Israel did.
That's correct.
And yet it was not able to accomplish, presumably, its objective, whether it was the regaining of the Golan Heights and so on. Do you have a comment on that? How can one understand that? What do you suppose happened?
I think I can, without damage to the reputation of the Department of State, comment on that. I've been interested in that for some time myself. The question was, for those of you who perhaps didn't hear it, how is it that with something in the range of a 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 tank advantage, 2 to 1 aircraft advantage, artillery proportions roughly the same, troop strength something like 7 or 8 to 1, that the Syrians were not able to regain the Golan Heights, take it from the Israelis. The Arabs in general, but Syria in particular, are not a technological, disciplined-oriented society. I think it's one of the benefits of travel. I think is you can see this, and careful observation and reflection on what's going on and how things happen, I think make it even clearer. I think one I could say about the Syrians, I could also say about the Egyptian front. One of the things that I observed and got into a violent exchange with a friend of mine in the U.S. military who was also assigned to Cairo when I was there, on the first day of the war, he suggested that the Israelis were not going to be as successful against the Arabs. and I argued they were. I submitted as evidence the question, have you ever watched an Egyptian cross the street? And he said, no. I said, well, notice that the overwhelming pattern, more than 9 out of 10, when they come to the corner to cross the street, they look to the right. Well, the traffic comes from the left because they drive on the right-hand side in Egypt just as they do in the United States. And you can't make the kind of mistake very often in combat. But the habits of life of people in developing countries is different. It's not geared to the kind of existence that one has in a city or in a country where their automobiles are a common thing, where a kid rides in an automobile sometime, I suppose from the first, after he's born, within 3 days he's going home in an automobile, and the whole kinetic experience of riding on wheels is something he grows up with and is natural to him. By the time he's 4 or 5, he's had his hands on a steering wheel, and by the time he's 15, he's driving his own car, can probably change the plugs and change at least a tire. But his whole concept of nuts and bolts and screws and how a gun operates, then this need to lubricate, that is to put oil in a vehicle, to put water in to cool it. He not only does these things, but he knows what the meaning of all these things are. So he knows how to fire an artillery piece, although he's never fired one. It's a matter of, really, I suppose, about an hour's instruction to the vast majority of Americans, and so too with the Israelis. But that's not true with the Syrians, Egyptians. To some extent it's true with the Palestinian population of Jordan, because they're much more sophisticated and modernized people. But by and large, the Arabs haven't had the kind of technological experience. They're not modern people. You don't have the level of literacy, for example. You can't hand out field manuals on how to operate in the field as you can with an American group. You pass out field manuals to sergeants, and he can go give instructions to 50 troops about how infantry platoon moves across a field. Well, to just stand up and run across the field isn't quite the way it's done. They have tactics, a system, fire and maneuver. When one group is firing, the other one moves. But if you don't have that, you can't inculcate that into the troops. They do things that cost lives. The system of responses. I think it's notable that the Arabs have had relatively little modern military experience, whereas a good many Jews have. Both in the United States and in Israel. And there is, I mentioned the Jews outside Israel because some of them have flowed into Israel to support the country at this time and to participate actually in combat. There was a Jewish brigade in the British Army in World War I, another in a Jewish and a French brigade in World War I, another in World War II. So they had experienced military commanders in modern warfare who had been up against tanks, long-range artillery, who have had missile experience in the current period. The Israelis, the Arabs, have had relatively little of that. They've had Soviet training for a limited period of time, but there is not, this is a personal remark based on observation and conversations with Arabs and some Russians. The Arabs and the Russians really don't groove together the way Westerners do with the Arabs. I think the Arab Legion in Jordan is one testimony and evidence of that. When with good leadership, with people who have had experience in modern technological societies, as the Palestinians in Jordan, and then the Jordan Arab Legion also, the Arabs can fight reasonably well. And as more and more young people, as the education, technological experience spreads, you get, I think, more of what happened in October of this year. The old inhibitions, fears of machines, fear of fire, explosions, loud noises, and so forth. All these things that one just doesn't get in a peasant village. They are a lost part of the experience. More people from the cities, more people who have had modern experience, television. It changes the whole frame of reference. One becomes less mystical, less dependent upon on powers outside oneself. Take responsibility for what happens to me, what happens on the field of battle. Well, I can go on, I suppose. That's my view. One last question, please.
Well, let me just,
Please.
maybe you can make it informal, because I think we have to get onto the classes.
Okay.
Maybe you can just ask them afterwards. You'll have another chance this afternoon to hear Mr. Wright talk on oil in the Middle East crisis. It's a question which is bothering many people. But I think we want to thank him this morning for an excellent presentation and a fine interchange, which I think has been very lively. Thank you so much.
Thank you.